Well, as I mentioned, this is the end of the year for the church. The end of the year, Christ the King Sunday. The last Sunday of the church year, and then once again we get on it feels a bit repetitive sometimes, especially as a pastor, because it seems like as soon as you get done with one, we're back on the cycle again. We start off with Advent. You can see why Christ the King Sunday is the last Sunday of the church year, because we start off the liturgical year with the season of Advent, preparing for the coming of Christ into the world, or preparing, in our case, for the coming of Christ once again into our lives. And then, of course, going through the teachings and the mission of Jesus Christ in the world before his passion, his crucifixion and resurrection. Christ the King Sunday is to culminate the church year, because it's supposed to remind us that that is the end result of everything that Jesus Christ has done. That Jesus Christ is Lord of all creation and King of the world. There's only one problem with that. We don't deal with kings very well. You know, as people in the United States, let's face it, we take great pride in the fact that we kind of kicked a king out of the United States. Didn't want anything to do with George III and the rest of the English kings. And I thought it kind of interesting, too, to discover that really the idea of Christ the King Sunday didn't develop until 1969. Most of us were part of the church long before there was a Christ the King Sunday. But the thing is, in the United States, we're about as far away from understanding what it means to be a king as we are from understanding what it really means to be a shepherd. A lot of the images that are used in the Bible are not ones that we deal with real well. We don't understand what the job of a shepherd really entails, nor do we understand what a king is all about. Our only exposure to kings or royalty anymore is on TV when we see Queen Elizabeth or some of the British royalty going through their state addresses, or when they're showing up for a wedding and everyone's so thrilled and excited, which I've yet to understand that either. But we really don't understand the idea of how a king's supposed to work. We know about all the bad things that kings can do. We've seen it, we've read our history, but we don't understand how it's supposed to work at its best. Mary Anderson's a Lutheran pastor, and she wrote an article about Christ the King for Christian Century, and she said, popular theology is not really involved with the idea of Jesus as king. We prefer the image of Jesus as CEO, a leadership role, but not really comparable to that of a king with a kingdom. Anderson raises some concerns about our images of royalty and worries that we might perceive that God's rule is similar to that of those people we see in England, where they have a title and they show up for grand events, but they don't really have any control over what happens. She said, do we view Christ as one surrounded with art or beauty of tradition, more antique than active? Do we see this figure of salvation as outdated and practically mute in our modern times? Those are some of the things we need to think about, because we talk about Jesus as king, but if you think about what a king's supposed to do, and that is to have utter control and command over everything that happens in his kingdom, do we really think that that's what Jesus has going on right now? You know, 15 years ago, a book came out that I'm sure all of us read, at least a great many of us, the Da Vinci Code. And since then, more people than ever before have been kind of intrigued by trying to understand some things about Jesus that they hadn't been aware of before. People who have read the Da Vinci Code started asking questions like whether or not Jesus could have been married to Mary Magdalene. And since that time, there have been a lot more authors putting out books about some of the Gospels that we've never heard of, like the Gospel of Thomas or the Gospel of Judas. We've also found out that there was, in the midst of everything in that book, some elements of truth, because the early church actually did suppress information and did actively seek to destroy manuscripts from Christian communities that taught ideas that were what they thought of as not orthodox. They weren't right. And some people have told me that, well, when they looked at those things in the book of the Da Vinci Code and they said, wow, could that stuff have really happened? And then to find out they did, well, it unnerved them. And they didn't even want to consider that some of the charges made could be true. But other people wanted to dig deeper and find out more about these questions, more truths about Jesus in early Christianity. The problem is the more answers we look for, the more questions we come up with. I find myself a bit feeling like Pilate when he asked Jesus, what is truth? Well, the truth is we live in an unsettling time in religious history. We live in what we call a pluralistic world, where there's a lot of different faiths competing for people's attention. Now, the reality is we've always lived in a pluralistic world, but we've been fairly compartmentalized and cocooned here in the United States for so many years. We thought of ourselves as a Christian nation. Then maybe we might spread it out a little bit and we'd call ourselves a Judeo-Christian nation, but the reality is we have a lot of religions within our bounds. For centuries, the church embraced the idea, though, of Christ as king, because we like the idea of a sovereign ruler who could have ultimate control of our destiny, someone who would fix everything. Until, of course, that person who's going to fix everything starts telling us things we have to do that we don't want to do. We want Jesus the King to come in as the big hero, not unlike a lot of those Marvel comic movies, where he comes in with his superpowers and suddenly makes everything right and everything's wonderful. That's what we want from Jesus, but we don't want Jesus to tell us the things we have to do to take part in making those changes. Those who are uncomfortable with the idea of Jesus as king often draw on the image from the Bible of Jesus as, well, someone who wasn't a political and military leader. You know, one of the things I've always had a hard time figuring out, we often say that, you'll hear people say, well, you know, when Jesus came into the world, the reason he was rejected by so many of the Jewish people was because he didn't fit the image they had. They had an image of someone who was descended from David and who would be a king in the same way that David was a king, who would lead military, battles, who would be the head of a government and would set everything right. And we say, well, they just weren't looking for the right Jesus. Of course, we know that Jesus was not like that at all. But then they'll turn around and say, no, but we're waiting for that second coming of Jesus, when Jesus will come on a big white horse and he'll fix everything and he'll lead us in battle. And you have to say, wait a minute. If it wasn't that way the first time, what makes you think he's going to be that way the second time? Jesus didn't bring a message of power and might, at least not in contemporary terms. He didn't build an army to defeat the Romans. And when asked if he was a king, he'd respond by saying, you say it, I don't. You said it, not me. He never claimed to be a king in political terms because he knew what that word meant, that idea of king would cause more problems and get in the way of his message rather than help it out. He didn't rule over a particular piece of geography. In the Gospel of John, Jesus speaks of a kingdom, but it's a kingdom of truth, not politics. And truth and politics don't go together very well. So what does that kingdom of truth look like? Well, that kingdom of truth is supposed to look like us. It looks like people of every race and nation who follow the teachings of Jesus Christ. Because that's what it means to be a Christian, after all. The term Christian means little Christ. And to be a little Christ is to be instructed by his teachings and to be transformed according to his truth. All of us together who follow Jesus are the kingdom of Jesus Christ in the world, the one he was speaking about. According to Mary Anderson, what we declare on the last Sunday of the church year is that Christ has made us a people. Not so much that it's Christ is king, but Christ has formed a kingdom with all of us. Everyone is welcome, especially those who are usually unwelcome anyplace else. In this kingdom, we're guided by two laws. Love God with all your heart, soul, and mind, and love your neighbor as yourself. Those ridiculously simple, easy teachings that are not simple and easy to follow. The image of Christ as King reminds us that if you do want to be called a Christian, those laws aren't optional. When a king gives a command, those are expected to be followed. We don't get to choose which neighbors we're going to love and which ones we won't. Sometimes Christians forget that. We like to cherry pick our neighbors. Jesus said to love your neighbor, all the neighbors, the ones that really, really disturb you most of all. Those are the ones you're supposed to pay most attention to. To reach out in love and justice on behalf of those who are oppressed, those who are hungry and in need, those who are unfairly judged, all the marginalized in society that we sometimes ignore. But we're supposed to welcome and serve all those people just as Jesus did, because that's what it means to be part of that kingdom. The goal of earthly kingdoms has always been power. If you read the stories of the Bible and you say, well, look at how they be fruitful and multiply, was what they were told in the Old Testament. Well, that was because the more people you had, the bigger an army you could have, the more ground you could cultivate, the more land you could hold on to. So population explosion was the whole reason for having your people be fruitful and multiply. But we're not looking for that kind of power. We want to multiply, but not multiply power, but multiply love. See, the world tells us that money is power, success is power, and knowledge is power, and power gets us what we want. But so often our desire for power is to have power over other people, power over our neighbors, power over other nations. We want to have power so that if we don't like the way something works, we can force it to be different, rather than trying to convince people to be different. People with power stand on a pretty slippery slope, because power over people eventually leads to oppression, injustice, and greed. Living as members of Christ's kingdom doesn't mean we have power over other people. The kingdom Jesus spoke of is a kingdom of the heart. The goal in Christ's kingdom is not power over others, but love and mercy having power over us. In that kingdom, we accept everyone and care for everyone. And the truly profound thing about Christ's kingdom is that that is where true power is. This much I know is true. The power to overcome injustice and oppression in the world was made known through Jesus Christ. Even when the United States is at its best, when we're trying to do our best in the world to try and cure injustices, it seems like we always make a mistake. About the time you put down one people to try and lift up another group of people, then you have people come back who are feeling they've been oppressed because we put them down. That's the problem with power in the world. Probably, if you want to look at politics and modern history, probably one of the best ways you can see the differences between power and love and mercy happened right after World War II. For those that will enjoy their history, there's one thing I love more than anything else, and that was something called the Marshall Plan. See, after World War I, if you remember, what happened was people were mad at Germany and they decided to be very punitive, and so the treaty they signed was oppressive and actually helped cause the rise of fascist Germany and brought about World War II. We did something different at the end of World War II, though, with Japan and Germany. George Marshall, a general in the Army and later Secretary of State, said, no, we're going to help them build up their war-torn economies. They were devastated by war, and instead of punishing them because they started things, we're going to help build things back up. It's rather strange that the two countries that were our greatest enemies just a short time ago are some of our strongest allies because we did that. We helped build them up. That's what we're to do as Christians, is to help build people up. We can't just say we believe in Jesus. We have to act like Jesus. It's a tough task, but it's ripe with potential for bringing change in the world. And we can do it if our hearts are transformed and fixed upon the goal of love and mercy for all people. But we have to choose which kingdom we want to serve. And we hope that we choose love rather than hate. Choose to smile rather than frown. To build up rather than destroy. To persevere rather than quit. To choose to praise rather than gossip. To choose to heal rather than wound. Choose to give rather than to grasp and hold on to. To choose to act rather than delay. To choose to forgive rather than to curse. And choose to pray rather than give in to despair. Those were all choices Jesus made. And choices we're called on to make. We can choose to be a member of Christ's kingdom, and we will find the truth there. And as they say, the truth will set us free.